C-SPAN is brought to you by your cable or satellite provider.
C-SPAN is live in Montana tonight, where Democratic U.S. Senator Jon Tester debates his Republican challenger Matt Rosendale. C-SPAN, your primary source for campaign 2018.
Montana PBS presents Debate Night, the 2018 race for the U.S. Senate. Brought to you in part by the Greater Montana Foundation, encouraging communications on issues, trends, and values of importance to Montanans. From the studios of KUFM TV on the campus of the University of Montana in Missoula, here are your hosts, John Twiggs and Anna Rao.
Good evening and welcome to Montana PBS Debate Night, the race for the U.S. Senate. I'm John Twiggs.
And I'm Anna Rao. We'd also like to welcome our viewers joining us on C-SPAN, on NHK Japan, and listeners on Montana Public Radio and Yellowstone Public Radio.
We utilized our inclusion requirements, which are available on our website at montanapbs.org, and the candidates meeting that criteria are here tonight.
They are two-term incumbent Democrat U.S. Senator Jon Tester, thanks for joining us tonight, and State Auditor Republican Matt Rosendale. Thank you.
Welcome to both of you. We have a slightly different format tonight. Each candidate will have an initial 90 seconds to answer the question. Afterwards, there will be an open discussion period for that particular topic with a chance for rebuttals or follow-up questions or direct exchanges. We will finish the debate tonight with a closing statement from each candidate. So let's get started with the event that has gripped our nation, the Supreme Court Justice confirmation process. And you both have spoken publicly about the fact that this is the most important decision and vote that a United States Senator can take on as part of his duties. So let's use this current confirmation process as an example. In addition to reiterating how you would vote or how you are voting, we'd like to hear tonight some insight into what informs your decision. What are the important factors in a monumental decision like this for a confirmation? We'll get your direct responses first, 90 seconds each, and based on the coin toss, we'll begin with Senator Tester.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you, Anna, and I want to thank Montana Public Television and Montana Public Radio for hosting this debate, and I want to thank Commissioner Rosendale for showing up at this one. We appreciate that. Look, confirmation of a Supreme Court, confirmation of cabinet officials, confirmation overall is one of the most important jobs a senator has to do. It's particularly important when it comes to the Supreme Court because this is a lifetime term. So when Judge Kavanaugh was nominated by President Trump, I went into the process of digging into his background to find out where he was on particular issues. I found out that he was one of the architects behind a mass surveillance program from the federal level. I found out that he backed and supported the Patriot Act. Both of those, I believe, are in direct violation of the Fourth Amendment. I found out that he supported dark money coming into campaigns, which, as anybody knows that watches TV these days, there's more dark money coming into these campaigns than there ought to be. And he also felt like it wasn't a person's right to choose their health care, but it was the government's right. For those reasons and all the reasons that were brought up last week, I made a decision yesterday to vote no on Judge Kavanaugh. I don't think he has the merits nor the background to meet the needs of the Supreme Court. Certainly don't think he understands the challenges that we have here in Montana from a Fourth Amendment privacy standpoint that would meet our needs.
Thank you, Senator Tester. Mr. Rosendale.
First of all, I would like to say I'm absolutely disgusted with the way this entire process was handled. Here we have a woman, Dr. Ford, who clearly experienced some tragedy in her life many years ago. And then we've got a judge, a commendable man, an honorable man who has served extremely well over the past several years, and he was smeared as well. And what disturbs me as much is that this all could have been avoided. We have the senior member of the Democratic Party, Dianne Feinstein, who withheld information for 60 days, that this could have been conducted in a fashion that they could have gathered information. The Democratic Party could have gathered information. They could have kept her, Dr. Ford's identity secret. They could have done a lot of this research, but they didn't. The Democratic Party, the Washington Democrats, made a decision 60 days ago that they were going to obstruct this process. Jon gave us his word nearly 3 months ago that he was going to at least take the time to meet with Judge Kavanaugh, and he didn't. He put off the meetings, At one point, Jon, he even came out and said that Washington, the White House, canceled your meeting, and then had to retract that statement. It just wasn't so. And so myself and a lot of the people across this nation are very disturbed with the way this entire process was handled. There's a man who has a commendable record, 300 decisions that he has written, and he should be serving on the bench, and absolutely I would vote for him.
Thank you, Mr. Rosendale. We're now to the part of the format where we'll have open discussion, a chance for rebuttals, follow-ups, or direct exchanges. I assume both of you have something that you want to follow up with, so we'll just continue with alternating, and for this particular section, then we'll start with you, Senator Tester.
John, I want to start out by saying, first of all, when he was nominated, I did the background work on him. The difference between myself and Commissioner Rosendale is that it was a day or two later after he was nominated that Commissioner Rosendale said he was going to vote for him. Like I said, this is an important job. You need to go find out the information. That's exactly what I did. As far as the meetings with Judge Kavanaugh, I think it's important to note that during my time in the Senate, whether it was a cabinet official or whether it was a Supreme Court nomination, I had always had the opportunity to meet with him. We put forth several dates to the White House. They couldn't make it work. I don't hold the White House responsible for that. Judge Kavanaugh has been a very busy man, as you know. But from basically the middle of August on, we put dates after dates after date. We got the email chain to do that. It didn't happen. I would have hoped it would have. It would have given me the opportunity to look Judge Kavanaugh in the eye and ask him the same questions about the Fourth Amendment, about his belief that dark money is okay to have in campaigns, and about a person's right to choose their health care. But it didn't happen. And so I had to go off the information that I investigated and determined that he was not a good candidate for the Supreme Court.
Mr. Rosendale?
It's amazing that something that is so critically important as a job for the United States Senate to confirm a Supreme Court justice, that time couldn't be found. Senator Manchin found the time. Senator Heitkamp found the time. There's lots of Democrats that found the time to give that man, Judge Kavanaugh, the courtesy of a meeting. And again, we just don't have the fact that the meeting never took place. What we have is the fact that Jon Tester came out and said the White House canceled his appointment, and it's just flat out blatantly false. And what is very disturbing to me is that the Democrats have played this resistance plan, and they came out and publicly said, the Washington Democrats came out and said that they do not want to seat this judge. They want to push this off. They want to delay it. They are hoping after hope that possibly they can maintain and gain some kind of a majority in the United States Senate after these midterm elections so that they would have more control over who gets seated there. And it's just very disturbing to myself and many people across the nation.
John, I put forth the dates. The dates didn't work for the White House. I can't help that. Look, I put forth the dates to be able to meet the needs of the candidates who are out there. I've met with every single person that I've wanted to meet with. And I wanted to meet with this guy. This is an important race. For Maryland Matt Rosendale to say what he said is absolutely ridiculous. And it's patently false. The other thing is you're really good at speaking the East Coast talking points. The fact is even the president said that this person was compelling. And I think that, quite frankly, if you combine the Fourth Amendment and his disregard for it, if you combine the dark money, which, by the way, is paying for over 80% of his ads, and you combine the fact that he believes it's the government's decisions, not a person's decision, to make health care decisions, a no vote was obvious.
Mr. Rosendale, we'll give you the final word here on this open discussion.
Jon may not like what I say, but it is the truth.
Thank you both for the additional thoughts on that topic. We're going to move forward now to another topic area that is of great importance to Montanans, and that's public lands.
Montana has 27 million acres of public land, and the outdoor industry adds an estimated $7 billion in spending to the state's economy annually. A key federal program to purchase and protect public lands, the Land and Water Conservation Fund, is set to expire tomorrow if Congress does not act to reauthorize and fund it. Do you believe Montana and the nation have enough public lands, or do you think we should acquire more, and how should those lands be managed? And this question goes first to Mr. Rosendale.
Well, first of all, I think the LWCF fund should be made permanent. I think it's critically important. Those funds had been generated by oil and gas development offshore, and they were earmarked to be used for recreational purposes, for hunting, for fishing, and I think they need to be made permanent because that is the only way that anybody can make any kind of a long-term plan. While I've served on the land board, I recognize that public lands and access to those lands is critically important for everyone across the state. There was a time when I thought that they could be better managed by the state, all of the lands, but we have about 35% of our state that is federal public lands, and I have since talked to people across the entire state, and they have made it exceedingly clear that they do not want those lands transferred, and I not only understand that, I agree with that. But I do still think that we have a role in making sure that they're managed properly. While I've been serving on the land board, we've increased access to public lands. As a matter of fact, we increased access to 45,000 acres of public lands that there prior to were not even accessible. We expanded access to 16 miles of roads to public access that, again, there prior to were not accessible. But in addition to that, we showed that we know how to manage those lands properly, and we harvested 47 million board feet of timber from those lands. And then there's other areas that are environmentally sensitive, that cannot support heavy traffic from motorized vehicles, like a walking trail system that we established north of Whitefish. And there's thousands of acres that we have reserved to make sure that they are protected for this walking trail system. In addition to that, this land board that I've been serving on is responsible for the largest land purchase that the land board, Montana Land Board, has ever made. And that was in Rosebud County, the Angela Farm transaction, just this past year. So we do understand that these lands are critically important and certainly are trying to make sure that the public has access to them.
Senator Tester.
Anna, the premise to your question is absolutely correct. $7 billion to the economy of the state of Montana, over 70,000 jobs. And by the way, it's what makes Montana the greatest state and the greatest country in the world, our public lands, to be able to go hunting and fishing and hiking and biking and access to those lands. The Land and Water Conservation Fund is the #1 tool for conservation that we have. I have fought over my tenure in the Senate to make sure that program is not only fully authorized, permanently authorized, but fully funded at $900 million a year. There's a lot of folks that stand up and say they'd like to see it authorized, but where the rubber meets the road is in the funding. And I've been a leader on it. It's one of the reasons I was asked to be on a call just last week to talk to national reporters about how important the Land and Water Conservation Fund was. But let's look at Commissioner Rosendale's real record. A few short years ago, he said, turn them over to the state, get rid of them. Federal government shouldn't have their hands in our public lands. A guy from Maryland would think that, okay? He comes back to the state of Montana and he runs for the House, but he doesn't understand how important those public lands are. They don't have many public lands in Maryland, but we do here in Montana. It's an incredible economic driver. So let's look at his record on the land board. Southwest Montana had an opportunity to put some land for hunters. Instead, it potentially goes to development. He voted against it. Southeastern Montana, a significant piece of land. Same thing, hunting, fishing, hiking, opportunities like no other state in the lower 48 have, by the way, and he votes against it. It is critically important that Montana has somebody in Washington, D.C. that will not just speak whatever he thinks will get him the votes, but will fight for Montana values and fight for our public lands. That's me.
Thank you both. We're now moving on to the open discussion portion of this current topic, which is public lands. And again, to keep the alternating going there, we'll let Mr. Rosendale start that section.
Again, the facts just don't prove out what John's stating over there. They just don't prove out. What we've shown is that we expanded access to 45,000 acres of public lands that the public previously didn't have any access to. I was responsible for negotiating. I literally sat down with DNRC and the parties and made sure that the Angela Farms transaction took place, and it's the largest land purchase that the Montana Land Board has ever made. So the facts just don't prove out what Jon's trying to say over there. Again, this is just part of the Washington Democrat smear technique that they've been using for quite some time, and the people of Montana know that I have. Not only have I done that as work on the land board, but I literally gave 11 acres to the city of Great Falls for a park myself on lands that previously were completely private, and I gave it to the city and irrigated it and put a playground out there for the children because there was so little open space out there for them to utilize.
Yeah, that was part of his land development, that he converted a farm into houses, which was what he does for a living. And if you don't have parks and you got houses, you got real problems. And by the way, Land Water Conservation Fund is used for those parks. It's where we have Travelers Rest. We're in Missoula tonight, south of here. But what you're saying, Matt, is revisionist history. Commissioner Rosendale, you voted against the Southwest Montana land transfer. You voted against the Southeastern Montana land transfer. You're either for public lands or you're not. I take your word from the beginning when you said, I don't think the federal government should have public lands, turn them over to the state. And by the way, if this is such a good idea, why does your party have part of its platform that the federal government gets rid of their land? You're a leader in the party. You should have stopped that, but you didn't. Why? Because in your gut, you don't believe the federal government should have federal lands.
Again, the facts just don't prove it out. 45,000 acres of access while Jon was closing down 21,000 miles of Forest Service roads here in Montana. I've been providing access, and the record shows it.
Any follow-up, Mr. Tester?
Well, the only thing I would say is that the fact that I shut down 23,000 miles of road is false, but I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about Matt Rosendale's land, or his record on public lands, and it doesn't pass the smell test. My record, you can talk to any of the conservation groups, you can talk to the hunting groups out there, the fishing groups out there, the folks that like to go out and just utilize our public lands. We've fought for and got access, and we've been able to do things up in Whitefish, for example, to protect their watershed for their water. It just, the list goes on and on and on. And so for him to say anything different than that is revisionist history.
Gentlemen, thank you both for additional thoughts on that very important topic. We're going to move forward now and talk about the economy.
All right. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act cut the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%, and the U.S. economy is growing rapidly with unemployment rates at their lowest level since 2000. However, the Congressional Budget Office estimates the Jobs Act will increase the deficit by nearly $1.9 trillion over the next decade, and wage growth remains slow for most employees, and rising inflation threatens to neutralize those increases. Do you feel the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act has been good for America? Why or why not? And this first response comes from Senator Tester.
Well, I think tax equity is critically important. I think simplifying the tax code is critically important. I don't think that the tax bill that was crafted in the dark of night in the back room does either of those things. And so I think that there is an opportunity to get bipartisan support on a tax bill that simplifies the tax code and makes it more equitable. Unfortunately, what this tax bill is give most of the benefit to the richest of the rich. But the biggest problem is what you said, Anna. It taxed $1.9 trillion onto our kids' debt. In other words, we got a tax break by having our kids write us a check when it should be the other way around. And that's not acceptable. And it puts us in a position where puts Medicare and Social Security at risk. And why I say that is because leadership in the House have already talked about methods to cut Medicare and privatize it and voucherize it, by the way, which Commissioner Rosendale doesn't think goes far enough. So everybody wants a tax break, but the bottom line is we don't do it on the backs of our kids. The debt's high enough. We need to do our level best to reduce the debt in times that are good, because we all know from our own family's sake, when times are bad, you increase debt. When times are good, you pay it down. What we've done the last year and a half is increase debt when the economy is going much better than it was in 2008.
Mr. Rosendale?
The tax cut legislation was an incredible boon for our country. I spoke to an electrician right here in Missoula not 3 weeks ago, and he's acquired another firm and brought 10 full-time employees in addition to what he already had there. I talked to an aviation firm down in Billings, and that gentleman, you talk about wages being stagnant, that gentleman awarded $800 and $1,000 bonuses to each and every one of his employees, And in addition to that, started increasing compensation. So we are seeing increased compensation. And not only that, but it's driving the economy in other areas. We see 400,000 jobs coming up in manufacturing now. That's critically important, not only because of the wages that those jobs pay, but also because of helping national security by bringing the manufacturing sector back to our country. It is critically important. The problem we have in Washington is spending, folks. It's spending. The Jobs Act and the CBO is estimating that we're going to generate about $3.4 trillion worth of revenue, and we're hoping that they're going to be accurate. The problem is we're going to spend record amounts of revenue, and that's $4.2 trillion. And while Jon talks about being fiscally conservative and being concerned about the debt, since he's been in Washington, he increased the debt ceiling 11 times. He stood before you 12 years ago and talked about it was one of the most important issues that we face, and yet he still continues to increase the debt.
Thank you, Mr. Rosendale. We'll move on into the open discussion portion now of our current topic on the economy. And again, to alternate back, we'll have Senator Tester start us.
The debt still continues to be one of the most important issues facing this country, and if we don't deal with it in a common sense way, we're going to be in big, big trouble when interest rates start to rise. That's why I've supported the balanced budget amendment. That's why I voted against 3 of the 5 last omnibus budgets that President Obama put forth. I thought they spent too much. This last budget, I supported it. Why? Because it helped rebuild the military. It helped do things like get money to counties for payment in lieu of taxes and secure real schools. It did things like make sure we have a secure border. So we supported it. The problem with the tax bill is this. Even 1.9 trillion is a very, very liberal estimate on what it's going to cost our kids. The conservative think tanks put it much, much higher than that. And when we have an opportunity to reduce the debt, we should do that. We had an opportunity and we took it the opposite direction. And so I think it's really, really easy to talk about, well, we're not going to spend any money. We've been at war for 17 years. Military had to be rebuilt. Malmstrom, the Air Guard, needed dollars for different infrastructure projects they had. This tax bill takes away a lot of that flexibility.
Mr. Rosendale?
Jon stood here 12 years ago and made fiscal sanity one of the biggest issues of the campaign, and he has raised the debt ceiling 11 times, and the national debt has rose from $8 trillion to over $21 trillion. So apparently he hasn't been looking too hard at it. There's got to be somebody who's willing to go into office and go through the budget line by line and take a look and see where they can reduce spending. In the auditor's office, I did that. I reduced my operating costs by 23% last year. I refused to take a pay raise last year and was the only elected official to do so, even though the state's budget was in a crisis and the governor was looking at calling the legislature back in for a special session. That's the kind of leadership that we need in Washington, D.C.
Well, the leadership that Commissioner Rosendale showed in the state legislature is the budget increased every year. And the fact is, I turned $3.3 million back to the state coffers from my state budget. And being an auditor for the state, he should know what the debt ceiling is. Obviously, he doesn't. The money's already been spent, auditor. If you don't increase the debt ceiling, you default. You should know that. You're a land developer. That's the kind of stuff that happens when you don't pay your bills. And the debt ceiling is simply paying the bills. It needs to start long before that. You need to make sure that we reduce waste, fraud, and abuse. The first bill that I passed this session, bipartisan bill with a senator from Nebraska, was a bill to reduce waste, fraud, and abuse. I've walked the walk. I just need some help in Washington, D.C. to make sure it happens on both sides of the aisle.
Mr. Rosendale, final word on this topic from you.
When Jon was in the Montana legislature, he's very aware that we had a balanced budget requirement within the Constitution, and we balanced our budget every single legislative session, as did he. He's been in Washington 12 years, and he forgot how to balance the budget.
But you didn't forget how to increase the state's budget, which is what you did when you were in the legislature.
We'll stop right there and move forward as we move on to our next topic. Thank you again, gentlemen, for your additional thoughts there. We're going on to a very complicated and difficult area, and that's to talk about health care. The people of Montana feel like they're in limbo at this point. Obviously, the last administration took a big swing at it with the Affordable Care Act. This administration has talked about repeal and replace, and neither one of those have happened, and I think Montanans feel like they're kind of caught in between with sort of a health care system. So let's talk about the future and your fundamental approach to legislation. And I would like to frame it this way. Do you see health care as a commodity where the marketplace could take care of the pricing, the marketplace could take care of access, or is it a moral obligation to provide health care to everyone? And for this one, we're going to start with Mr. Rosendale.
Thank you so much. And excuse me, I'm really thrilled to be able to take this on first. Everyone in the state knows that Jon brought us Obamacare. He literally was the deciding vote to bring Obamacare to the state of Montana. He stood with President Obama and said that your premiums are going to go down by $2,500, that you're going to be able to keep playing if you like it, and that you're going to be able to keep your doctors if you like it. And we now know that all of those statements were false. And what disturbs me the most is I think everybody knew walking into it that they were false. That is a big problem. Since I entered into the auditor's office, I worked to try and cover pre-existing conditions. I am thrilled now that the governor has a working group and they're sitting down and he's actually looking at a lot of the things that I had put forward during the 2017 regular and special sessions so that we can cover pre-existing conditions. But in addition to that, we've got to do several other things, and this is going to be managed at the state level a lot better than it will by having a top-down, one-size-fits-all federal government plan that Jon tried to impose upon us. We've got primary care provider agreements people are utilizing. We've got short-term plans that have been extended out to 3 years thanks to the president, and we've got association health plans so that people can start joining health care plans with groups like the farm, like the Chamber of Commerce and the Farm Bureau. And those are the kind of things in competition that are going to make sure that everybody's health care gets accommodated in a fashion that accommodates their budget, their personal health care needs, and their personal choices.
Thank you, Mr. Rosendale. Senator Tester.
Everybody knows that health care costs are too high. There's no doubt about that. And I think they look to the federal government to try to make sure that we can get them affordable. I can tell you that early on in Charlotte and my marriage, we went without health insurance. We had a choice, either pay the bills or we buy health insurance, and we chose not to buy health insurance and pay the bills. And very, very tough time, because every time you get a pain in your back, you wonder if something might be far greater than just a pain in your back. So I've been there. I understand it. And I think if we were able to work in a bipartisan way on health care and health insurance and making health care more affordable, I think we can come to some conclusions. Unfortunately, this issue has been far, far, far too politicized. There's an interesting point to bring up, because early on in this Congress, Patty Murray is a Democrat and Lamar Alexander is a Republican. We're working on ways to work together in a bipartisan way to reduce health care costs. They were told to not do that anymore. And those negotiations didn't continue. I don't know who told them it, but the truth is that's exactly what needs to happen. Commissioner Rosendale has supported policies to kick people with pre-existing conditions off their health care policy. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. He rubber stamped a 23% increase for the largest health insurance carrier in this state. And why that's particularly important is because the other health insurance companies came in at single digits. And he went to Florida, got money from junk insurance, short-term insurance companies, took their money, $13,000 that he deposited in his own bank account, I might add, and then came back and was in favor of short-term / junk insurance policies. And they're called junk because they don't cover anything. They're junk. That's his record.
Senator Tester, thank you. We're now going to move into the open discussion portion on this very important topic of health care. And again, I know you both have something that you want to follow up with, so we're going to start with Mr. Rosendale.
Sure. I laugh at Jon's comments because they've already been refuted by Montana's media. Again, this is just the Washington Democrat smear techniques that they use. They've literally, those claims have already been refuted. What I will tell you is that he hasn't brought any solutions for it, and I have, so that people can accommodate their health care in a way that accommodates their budget, their personal needs, and their personal choices. The other place that we have to go to is transparency. And I've taken legal action against the big pharma companies here in Montana that are not disclosing what their contracts say and gag orders that they've tied into with different organizations around the state, and just how much money was flowing through their system. So we've taken legal action against them because we've discovered that the pharmaceutical industry is one of the biggest drivers, cost drivers for the healthcare industry. So we are making steps. We're making sure that people have options. We're making sure that the other folks are being held accountable, and we're trying to do it at the local level to make sure that pre-existing conditions are always covered.
You want to talk about solutions in healthcare? I've had plenty of them. More transparency in drug pricing. If a prescription drug company wants to raise their prices, they have to justify why. We pay for a lot of research for prescription drugs. We ought to know if it's public dollars that are being used or private dollars, so that we can determine whether those increases are fair. Pharmacy benefit managers have got a bill to take those out of the equation. It's an unnecessary middleman that shouldn't be there. I've worked hard to get more residency slots in Montana, both for general practitioners and for mental health practitioners. Why? Because the more doctors we have, the more competition there is. It'll help drive prices down. That goes on and on and on. I think it's interesting, and it is unbelievable that the Commissioner Rosendale would say that he did not go to Florida. He did not take checks from short-term insurance companies and say that the press proved that wrong. They did not. They said you did exactly that, and that you found a loophole around the law to take it out of your personal checking account and put it into another account. Listen, Montanans understand campaign finance. We remember the days of the Copper Kings when they tried to buy our government. The spirit of this law, you went around it, and there is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You took the money, you put it in your own personal account, then you put it in another account. By the time you got done shilling through all the different accounts, people had a hard time keeping track of it. And then you come back and you support junk plans.
So, I find it laughable that Jon Tester stands there and talks about campaign finance, and he is the largest recipient of contributions from lobbyists in the nation. And again, the Montana media has already refuted most of the commercials that he has run. Not the dark money folks that he brought into the state that have spent about $10 million against me, but the commercials that Jon has been put out there that were making these claims, and they said that a lot of that stuff was false. It was flat out false. But again, this coming from a man who's the largest recipient of contributions from lobbyists across the nation. More than Nancy Pelosi, more than Chuck Schumer.
Which I will tell you depends on what metrics you want to run by, but that doesn't really what matters here. What matters here is Commissioner Rosendale. You want to talk about dark money? I paid for my ads. There's a few dark money ads on. I can't stop them. You actually go to the folks who provide the dark money and cut deals with them to run ads in Montana.
All right.
And then I would just say this really quick, John, if I might, and then you can let him respond to this.
Okay.
And then when a major donor comes up to him and gives him a check, when he's running for insurance commissioner, and then he becomes insurance commissioner, meets with him on the second meeting, drops all the charges that were brought against him by the previous commissioner, that is what people hate about politicians and what they hate about politics. Buying them. And he was bought, just like the dark money advocates have bought him. He'll be a yes vote for him.
Mr. Rosendale, I want to give you a final response.
Three words: Washington, Democrat, smear. Plain and simple.
3 words. Rosendale, 4 words, is the swamp.
All right, we went completely off the rails from healthcare there, but you both got your points in there.
We're try and get them back onto a topic here.
We're gonna move back now and move on to again another topic of great interest here in Montana, and that's veterans.
That's right. Per capita, Montana has one of the largest populations of veterans in the nation. Recent studies have shown that VA hospital care is as good or better than private hospitals, and generally speaking, veterans are happy with the care they receive once they get through the door. But getting in to see a doctor has been a problem. There have been efforts in Congress to allow veterans to see private doctors when they cannot get an appointment at the VA. Privatization is a loaded word, but is that the direction we need to go, or would that be a bad idea? And this first response goes to Senator Tester.
Well, thank you for the question. I take taking care of our veterans as a very important responsibility for this country, whatever era they come from. And we've worked hard to make sure that the problems that the VA has, they can address. We've put 10 bills on the President's desk this Congress, worked in a bipartisan way to do it. The last one was the Mission Act, which will replace the Private Sector Choice Act from before, and I think it's going to work really well if we can get the VA to implement it properly. But we did some things on accountability. We did some things to cut down the backlogs in the VA. We've worked hard to make sure the VA can recruit and retain good doctors, including mental health folks. But we still have a ways to go. But we're still going to work together, and we're going to continue to work together in a bipartisan way to make sure the facility's there and make sure that those facilities are staffed. There's a staffing problem within the VA. I would say that's their major problem right now. On the other hand, you have Commissioner Rosendale, that while in the state legislature voted against the Southwestern Montana Veterans Home, that's the Veterans Home in Butte, that's being built as we speak. He voted against funding for the Columbia Falls Veterans Home. He voted against scholarships for Purple Heart veterans. He voted against housing loans for Gold Star families, folks who have lost a loved one. I work every day, I get up every day, trying to make sure we do right by our veterans in this country. I don't think Commissioner Rosendale has had a day where he's actually supported them.
Mr. Rosendale?
Of course I support our veterans. My dad served in the Marine Corps. My younger brother served in the Marine Corps. Fortunately, they both did their time without getting injured. But what I do find a problem with is that the veterans across the state who I've been meeting with regularly, I've got an advisory panel that's got members from across the entire state, and they give me information and say that they're being forced to wait 60 and 90 days before they can even see a physician of their wanting. They're being forced to go out of state to Colorado and to Washington State to see specialists because they can't have their needs accommodated here. We do have a staffing problem. We have an incredible staffing problem, and I think that our veterans all kept their promises to the people of this nation, and it is far past time where the nation keeps their promises to the veterans. And I've been working extremely hard to find and identify the deficiencies, which is staffing. I see a lot of money that goes out and new facilities are being built, but we're not putting proper staffing in there. As far as the Veterans Home in Southwest Montana, it still hasn't broken ground. And I will tell you, when I served in the legislature, there was not federal funds available to it. So I worked in good faith with other legislators to try and make sure that we could provide those funds at the state level, because as many of you know, federal funds are unreliable and they're heavily restricted. And so I tried to make sure that we could get those funds at the state level to start construction on that home.
Thank you, Mr. Rosendale. We'll move on to the open discussion on our current topic of veterans care. And again, we'll alternate back and we'll have Senator Tester get us started.
John, I think it's absolutely amazing that we're here. He voted against funding for the Southwest Montana Veterans Home. That funding was absolutely necessary if we're going to be able to match it with federal dollars, which we did once it was passed. The Butte delegation did a fine job. He obviously didn't care about the Southwest Montana Veterans Home, which, by the way, they're putting infrastructure into that home as we speak. They're laying the water and the electricity. And it will get built. It will get built because the legislature stepped up without Commissioner Rosendale's help, and the federal government stepped up because they knew that our veterans were that important. I would also say this, whether it's the Missions Act or reducing the appeals backlog, or whether it's making sure we have accountability with the employees within the VA, I've worked very hard in a bipartisan way, getting input from folks. I remember the first time that I had a roundtable discussion after I was elected, and a Vietnam veteran walked up and said, "You're not going to treat this generation of veterans like you treated ours." And I've done my level best to make sure to live up to the promises. That veteran was spot on. And I can tell you, because of the Vietnam veterans in this country, we are treating this next generation better. But we still have a long ways to go to fully meet the needs, both from a healthcare standpoint, a housing standpoint, and an educational standpoint for our veterans.
Mr. Rosendale?
We do have a lot of work to do. And while I do appreciate the legislation that Senator Tester has put through, it's not improving the conditions on the ground enough. I spoke to veterans from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and they're experiencing some of the very exact same things that our veterans from the Vietnam War did when they had Agent Orange exposure. And they've got these burn pits. And the Veterans Administration is simply not taking care of this fast enough. They're sending these gentlemen and ladies out to get testing, and then they're not honoring the tests that they're getting done out in the private sector. We've got to get treatment, we've got to get it faster, and I'm not going to stop until we have proper leadership and administration in the Veterans Administration to make sure that those services are delivered.
Well, I'll just
Go ahead.
close if I might. I think we may agree on this issue more than any of the others previously on this debate. We have to step up and take care of our veterans. We've been at war far, far too long, and we need to do it in a bipartisan way, and that's exactly how I've tried to proceed in Washington, D.C. on the Veterans Committee and in the United States Senate.
Mr. Rosendale, I'd like you to have the last word on this topic.
Again, we have to look at the administration and the leadership that is installed in these places right now and make sure that we are staffing properly. Our veterans deserve to have the care that they want, when they want it, and where they want it, period.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rosendale. Gentlemen, we're going to move forward now to another complex and multifaceted issue, and that's the topic of immigration. I think each of your political parties loves to throw around the stereotypes of each party for this, and then eventually that becomes personal. So you're too soft on this, or you're heartless about that. It goes back and forth. But you're both here, and you're both on the record saying you want to protect the border. You obviously want to do it in different ways. So let's hear it from you tonight. What is the best way to secure our borders, and how do we go about paying for that? And we're going to start with you, Mr. Rosendale.
Thank you very much. And this is a very critical time in our nation's history. We have to secure our border. We have to secure our border. And some of that is going to require that we build a wall. Some of that very well may be monitored with other devices, whether they be drones or ICE, to go down and find out border patrol agents to make sure that we're not having the border penetrate. But we've got to secure the wall. And once we secure our southern border, then we have to deport criminals. We cannot have these people running around our country committing crimes and allow them to hold up in sanctuary cities, which Jon Tester has supported time and time again. We just cannot have that. And we've got to deport the criminals, and then we have to go in and put a process in place where we can identify who is coming into our country, how long they're going to be here, and what are they going to be here for. That is very important. People talk about the immigrants and the immigration that's taking place, and they talk about labor needs, and we can have that discussion and figure out what is the best way and what is the number of people that should be here and make sure that they're properly vetted. But I will tell you that by not having our southern border secured, we have a lot more problems than just immigration. There's a steady flow of drugs that comes into our country and human trafficking that is taking place on that southern border, and it's causing social and economic problems throughout the nation, not just on the southern states.
Thank you, Mr. Rosendale. Senator Tester.
Well, I think it's critically important we make sure we have our southern border secure. And I think it should be, and the northern border too, and the ports too, by the way. They will go to the weakest link in the chain, the people who want to do us harm. So, but I think it takes a combination of all three things. A wall where appropriate. Technology, which you can do pennies on the dollar for what it costs for a wall. And then manpower. And I think if we're able to do that and make sure that our ports have the technology in particular and the manpower to stop the drugs coming across, to make sure that we have the kind of infrastructure that we need on the border to make sure that folks that are undocumented cannot come across the border, I think we've taken a giant first step. And it's one of the reasons the Border Patrol Council has endorsed me. They didn't endorse Commissioner Rosendale, they endorsed me. This is the same outfit that endorsed President Trump and Senator McCain, by the way. They are the folks that are on the border. These are the guys and gals that keep this country safe by patrolling our border. And I value that because they understand that I'm going to fight for them to make sure they get what they need to be able to secure that border. And as far as the safe havens issue that he talks about, I think it's interesting that he even brings it up. The bottom line is in every one of those bills that pulled money from law enforcement, mainly. There was one of them, I believe, that pulled money from economic development. Look, I've been around the state. I've talked to law enforcement. You can't pull money from law enforcement. That doesn't make your communities more safe. And so the bottom line is that I know that in the past, Commissioner Rosendale has voted to cut funding for local law enforcement. And he talks about human trafficking. He was one of 7 senators in the state legislature that voted not to increase the penalties on human trafficking. Bottom line is, I got endorsed by the Border Patrol because they understand that I'm tough on immigration and will give them the resources they need. Thank you.
Let's move on to the open discussion portion of this, and I'll throw in my own request here as we shift over. We've heard about border security. I'd like to hear a little more. You kind of touched on it a little bit, just the idea of legal immigration, of what that would look like, what your vision for that would be as we go forward in this process with immigration. So, Mr. Rosendale, why don't you get us started?
I think the first thing is that we have to identify exactly what labor needs are necessary to be filled with the marketplace. And until we do that, then it's very difficult to establish a line of how many people, a number of how many people should be coming into the country. And then if we are going to allow these folks to come into the country, we should make absolutely sure that they are trained and have support in place so that when they do get here, that they are going to become contributing members of society. We've had, obviously, our country is very, very generous and has a long, long record of embracing immigration. Everyone in this room has their ancestors, their forefathers came from somewhere else before they landed here. And so I think that it's a critical part of continuing this large melting pot that we have, but we have to identify what the needs are and make sure that folks that are coming in embrace our culture and love the United States the same as the folks that are already here and are going to contribute.
Senator Tester?
Well, I think, John, all you have to do is look back to a few years back when the Senate passed a bipartisan comprehensive immigration bill. That bill started out by putting incredible investments on the borders and the ports. And that's why I believe it got the vote it did. Unfortunately, it ended up in the House, and the House didn't take it. But it also gave folks a pathway for citizenship if they learned English, if they paid their taxes, and if they obeyed the law. Then you go to the back of the line and you work your way through it. The same way my ancestors did. John, probably the same way yours did too. And I think that's the direction we need to go to make sure that we secure the borders first, make sure they are secure, and then move forward with an immigration package that can work for this country. I think it's critically important.
Yeah. Mr. Rosendale, anything you'd like to add?
I hear John saying these things, but he has not supported the president when the president is trying to get proper funding to secure our border. And that is where it all begins. We have to secure the border. But he has supported the Washington Democrats when they want to set up sanctuary cities and, as you just heard, grant amnesty to hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of people that came here and their first act was to violate our laws. And I just don't support that.
And a final word, Senator Tester, as we wrap up this topic.
Well, I would just say this. I've talked about Commissioner Rosendale's lack of respect for funding local law enforcement. And he wanted me to vote for bills that pull away from local law enforcement. I'm not going to do that. I support bills that actually empower them. And I think that we can do better in a bipartisan way moving forward. I don't know where he gets amnesty from. I've never supported that, but I have supported comprehensive immigration that makes people get into line and follow the laws, learn the language, and pay their taxes.
Gentlemen, thank you both for that, and we're going to move on to a next topic, although I think we already were digging into this topic earlier, but I guess we'll try it again.
Well, this one, yeah, we did talk about this a bit earlier, but I'm sure there's more to it. According to a recent report from the Wesleyan Media Project, during the first 2 weeks in September, the number of outside ads targeting federal candidates has increased 85% since 2014. The ads attack both of you, and they are overwhelmingly negative. Some of these groups, the so-called dark money groups, do not have to reveal their donors. Do you believe outside spending is a problem? And if so, what would you do to address it? And the first person who gets to answer this is Senator Tester.
Well, I will tell you that I think that transparency in our elections is critically important. I think one of the things we have in Montana is we've got a transparent government, and I think it makes government work better. I think elections are part of our government that needs to be transparent. I think why we're seeing issues like this is because the Supreme Court passed a Citizens United bill. Montanans know better than anybody. I mean, the Copper Kings over 100 years ago tried to buy our government, and Montanans spoke up and said things like, corporations aren't people, and we're going to have limits on the amount of money that goes in. And that's exactly what they need to do in Washington, D.C. That's exactly the kind of bills that need to pass. And that's why I have supported bills like that every time they've come up, to increase the transparency so we have maximum transparency on the dark money that's coming into this group, into these elections. Why? Because we need to know who's trying to influence our elections. It's really important. It's one of the reasons that I am endorsed by a group called End Citizens United. They want Citizens United. Let's go back to the way it was before Citizens United. So we have limits. So corporations aren't people. Commissioner Rosendale, by the way, is endorsed by Citizens United, the folks who want more dark money. Why? Because they know they can get his vote when he gets elected. It's really important for Montana that we have more transparency. I think it's important for the country. I think our democracy depends upon it.
Thank you, Senator Tester. Mr. Rosendale.
Again, it's almost laughable if it wasn't so sad. Jon Tester's outside groups have spent $10 million against me, and the End Citizens United group is another one of those groups that has hidden contributors, and yet they're running ads about fighting against so-called dark money. It is the height of hypocrisy. I think that what we need to focus on is make sure that we get instantaneous notification on the contributions that the candidates are receiving, like all the lobbyist money that Jon is receiving. He's the #1 recipient of lobbyist contributions across the nation, more than Chuck Schumer, more than Nancy Pelosi. And these are the kinds of things that people want to know, who are entering in and trying to affect our elections.
Thank you, Mr. Rosendale. We're going to go into the open discussion period now, and we're going to make this one a little bit shorter since we plowed over this ground a little bit earlier, but a chance for each of you to, again, follow up on something that you've already mentioned to this point. So, Senator Tester, we'll start with you.
Well, I think if you just take a look at the ads that are on TV, how many are paid for by the dark money groups, you can see that the vast majority of his ads are by the folk. We don't know who they are. We don't know who they are. And he's actually lobbied some of them to try to get them to run ads in the state of Montana, which, by the way, is illegal. He's tried to do everything to get around the spirit of our campaigns laws here in Montana. I, on the other hand, have supported time and time again efforts in Washington, D.C. to try to make our elections more transparent. I think it's important. I think the reason you know who my donors is, and by the way, I think the reason that we're going to have immediate notification of who donors to a campaign instead of at the end of the quarter is because of a bill that I dropped in back in 2008 that we finally got to the president's desk last week. And so I'm going to continue to fight for more transparency in elections. I think that as Commissioner Rosendale, all you have to do is look at the ads, man. Every one of them are paid by a dark group. My ads, I'm Jon Tester and I approve this message.
Mr. Rosendale?
Many of which have been proven false. First, last thing I will say is that there's Democrats across the nation that have called for the so-called dark money groups to stay out of their state. And if Jon was so concerned, he could have done that. And he hasn't. They continue to bail money in to help his campaign.
Gentlemen, thank you both for, again, additional thoughts on our final topic there of dark money. We've almost reached the end of our hour here, and so we're going to have closing statements from each of the candidates, a chance for them to wrap up tonight's event. And per the coin toss earlier, we're going to start with Senator Tester.
Well, Jon, I want to thank you. I want to thank you, Anna, for a very well-run debate. And I want to thank the University of Montana for allowing us to be on their campus in this beautiful studio. Look, I think that this debate has shown that this race, from a standpoint of what we stand for, is 180 degrees off. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. You've got myself, who've been born here, raised here, educated here. Married a woman who was also born here, raised here, and educated here. Somebody who has had the privilege, and I mean that, the privilege of farming the land that my grandparents homesteaded here in Montana. And my parents farmed from the 40s through the late 70s. Somebody who knows the value of public lands. Somebody who understands that healthcare isn't as easy as just pulling the plug, but actually putting forth policies that can work for rural America. Somebody who understands education. We didn't get into education much, but the fact is I think we need to make public education more better for our kids, not privatize it or turn it into charter schools like my opponent wants. And then you've got Commissioner Rosendale, somebody who's a developer from Maryland who made his millions there, came to Montana, bought a ranch, claimed to be a rancher but has no cows. Doesn't understand public lands, doesn't understand healthcare, doesn't understand education. The choice is obvious. I would appreciate your vote on Election Day.
Thank you, Senator Tester. Mr. Rosendale.
Jon, Anna, thank you so much for hosting us this evening, and the University of Montana as well. And Jean, thank you so much for joining me tonight. You are my rock, honey. 33 years we've been married, and she's always by my side. You know, Jon stood before the people of Montana 10, 12 years ago and said that there was a problem with the lobbyist money being involved in our elections, and he would not be encumbered by it. And yet he's the largest recipient of lobbyist contributions in the nation. Jon stood here 12 years ago and said that there was a problem with spending in Washington, D.C., and he has since increased the debt ceiling 11 times and increased the national debt from $8 trillion to over $21 trillion. Jon Tester, the fact of the matter is, bought a $1 million home in Washington, D.C., and he left Montana in the rearview mirror. You know, there's people that go into Washington and they get completely intoxicated with power and privilege, and they start thinking about the next election instead of the next generation. And I will tell you, that's why I have committed that if I am fortunate enough to be elected, to only serve 2 terms. I believe in term limits. I believe that that power and privilege is intoxicating. I would humbly ask for your vote, and I'd like to have that this November so I could have the honor of serving each and every one of you in Washington, D.C. God bless every one of you. Thank you.
Mr. Rosendale, thank you. We want to thank both of the candidates for being here tonight and how very important it is to get together in the same room and have a discussion about the issues like we've had this evening. We want to remind our viewers and listeners that you can go over to our website, montanapbs.org, for a follow-up and fact check on everything that you've been hearing tonight. We invite you to visit that site as well. And we also want to thank everyone on our production crew for participating with us here this evening. And of course, our viewers and listeners who have joined us here this evening. We want you to participate in the process, whether that's voting early or getting out there on Tuesday, November 6th. Please do get out and vote. From all of us here at Montana PBS, thank you for joining us, and good night.
This Montana PBS presentation of Debate Night, the 2018 race for the U.S.
With the control of Congress in question this election day, see the competition for yourself on C-SPAN. Watch the debates from key House and Senate races. Make C-SPAN your primary source for campaign 2018.
President Trump will speak at a rally in Johnson City, Tennessee, for former Representative Marsha Blackburn, who is running for the Senate